That's between them and God. You're not going to answer for them. See, that's the thing. We have to quit responding wrong to other people's wrongs.
For decades, Joyce Meyer has preached to millions about faith, resilience, and overcoming life's darkest moments. Yet controversy has followed her every step. Now, at 83, she appears ready to reveal it all. Is this a confession about the lavish lifestyle that sparked a Senate inquiry? A response to years of criticism over prosperity theology? Or is there an even bigger secret? The truth may surprise you. In fact, much about her life and choices might surprise you. Let's start from the very beginning. The broken life nobody saw. Long before millions knew her as Joyce Meyer, the best-selling author with a global television ministry, her life looked nothing like the confident public image people recognize today. She was born Pauline Joyce Hutchison on June 4, 1943, in St. Louis, Missouri, during the final years of the Second World War. Today, she is known for filling arenas, publishing more than 100 books, and broadcasting sermons across the world. But those accomplishments make it easy to overlook a far more complicated beginning. Looking back through her own interviews and autobiographical writings, her story was one of instability, fear, and the painful experiences that she says almost defined the course of her life. From the outside, there was little to suggest the turmoil inside her home. Joyce has often described growing up in an environment that was far removed from the peaceful Christian household many assume she experienced. Instead of security and encouragement, she has recalled feeling isolated, emotionally wounded, and constantly searching for acceptance. Those early years left deep emotional scars that would influence nearly every decision she made as a young woman. While she rarely dwells on those years without eventually discussing faith, she has consistently emphasized that her childhood created patterns of insecurity and low self-worth that followed her well into adulthood. At the time, however, she had no way of knowing just how much those struggles would shape her future. Like many young women searching for stability, Joyce believed marriage might offer the fresh start she desperately wanted. Instead, it became another painful chapter. She married while still very young, hoping to build a different kind of life from the one she had known growing up. Those hopes quickly unraveled. The relationship became emotionally destructive, and she later revealed that her husband was repeatedly unfaithful. Rather than finding the security she longed for, she found herself trapped in another unhealthy environment. The marriage would ultimately last only a few years, but its impact stayed with her much longer. The emotional pain was only part of the story. Joyce has also spoken candidly about financial betrayal during that first marriage, describing how her husband took money she had carefully saved. For someone already struggling with trust and self-confidence, it was another devastating blow. Money was not simply money. It represented independence and the possibility of building a new future. Losing those savings reinforced the feeling that the people closest to her could not be relied upon. In later interviews, she would describe this period as one in which she felt defeated, confused, and uncertain whether life would ever improve. When her marriage ended, Joyce found herself standing at one of the lowest points of her life. You see, divorce carried significant social stigma during the 1960s. Beyond the emotional toll, she was left trying to rebuild her confidence while carrying the weight of past disappointments. There were no best-selling books, no international conferences, and certainly no television ministry waiting around the corner. But then, everything changed when she met Dave Meyer, an engineering draftsman who would later become her husband and one of the key figures in her ministry. The two married in January of 1967, and unlike her first relationship, Joyce has consistently described this marriage as one built on stability, patience, and mutual support. Dave would eventually leave his own career to help manage the growing ministry. But in the beginning, theirs was an ordinary family life. They raised 4 children while Joyce continued searching for a deeper sense of purpose, attending church, and gradually becoming more involved in Bible study. One moment in particular stands out in Joyce Meyer's own account of her spiritual journey. She has often spoken about a profound religious experience in 1976, while driving to work early one morning. According to Joyce, It was during that drive that she felt God calling her toward a completely different direction in life. Soon afterward, she began leading small Bible studies, teaching classes at her local church, and accepting invitations to speak. There were no massive audiences or television cameras then, but this was the beginning of something much bigger. Building an empire and becoming one of America's most controversial preachers. After years of teaching small Bible studies around the St. Louis area, her audience steadily grew through word of mouth. Listeners were drawn to her plain-spoken style, willingness to discuss personal struggles, and practical approach to Scripture rather than formal theological lectures. By the early 1980s, what began as local gatherings had evolved into a full-time ministry. In 1985, she officially founded Life in the Word, the organization that would later become Joyce Meyer Ministries. Television proved to be the turning point. At a time when Christian broadcasting was becoming increasingly influential across the United States, Meyer recognized that reaching people beyond church walls required embracing new media. Her program, eventually renamed Enjoying Everyday Life, expanded from regional broadcasts to international television networks, reaching audiences in dozens of languages and well over 100 countries. Alongside television came conferences that filled arenas across North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. At the same time, her publishing career exploded. Over the decades, Meyer authored more than 100 books, with titles such as Battlefield of the Mind, becoming international bestsellers and selling millions of copies worldwide. The ministry's influence extended far beyond preaching. Joyce Meyer Ministries established humanitarian programs that funded disaster relief, orphan care, anti-human trafficking initiatives, clean water projects, feeding programs, and medical outreach across multiple continents. Supporters pointed to these efforts as evidence that the ministry's success translated into tangible, global impact. Critics, however, argued that the rapid growth also concentrated extraordinary financial and organizational power in the hands of a single ministry. As donations increased, and Meyer became one of the most recognizable faces on Christian television, admiration was increasingly matched by skepticism. The larger the ministry grew, the more intensely people began examining exactly what Joyce Meyer was teaching. Much of that debate centered on the prosperity gospel, a movement broadly associated with the belief that God desires believers to experience blessing, including financial provision, health, and success. Critics argued that prosperity teaching risks reducing faith to a formula for material gain and can create unrealistic expectations among struggling believers. Supporters countered that Scripture contains numerous examples of God blessing faithful people materially, and that financial prosperity, when handled responsibly, is not inherently incompatible with Christianity. Joyce Meyer often found herself placed somewhere in the middle of this debate. Then there was her association with the Word of Faith movement. This theological stream emphasizes the power of faith-filled speech, confidence in God's promises, and believing for victory over life's challenges. During the earlier years of her ministry, Meyer made statements that critics believed reflected some of the movement's more controversial teachings. Some of the strongest criticism came from well-known evangelical figures such as John MacArthur, who challenged prosperity theology as fundamentally inconsistent with the New Testament. Discernment Ministries criticized Joyce Meyer's sermons and books, questioning her biblical interpretations and emphasis on personal success. Supporters argued critics ignored context and the practical impact of her teachings. Meyer has never claimed to be infallible, admitting some early teachings would be expressed differently today as her understanding of Scripture has grown. Supporters see this as humility and spiritual growth, while critics argue her revisions did not fully address concerns about her earlier theological positions. What makes Joyce Meyer particularly fascinating is that she never retreated from public criticism. Instead of avoiding difficult questions, she often addressed them directly in interviews and sermons, insisting that disagreement comes with any public ministry. She repeatedly argued that her primary responsibility was to teach the Bible as she understood it, rather than trying to satisfy every theological camp. That approach won admiration from followers who appreciated her confidence but further frustrated critics who believed more substantial corrections were needed. The result was a ministry that continued growing despite decades of sustained opposition from some of the most prominent voices within evangelical Christianity. By the beginning of the 21st century, Joyce Meyer had become something few religious leaders ever achieve. Instantly recognizable even outside church circles, her books occupied bestseller lists, her conferences attracted tens of thousands of attendees, and her television program reached viewers across the globe. Yet success came with an unavoidable consequence. The larger her platform became, the more every sermon, financial decision, and theological statement was examined under a microscope. To supporters, she represented resilience, practical faith, and hope. To critics, she symbolized the growing commercialization of modern Christianity. This brings us to where she stands today, and why that has become controversial. The million-dollar lifestyle that sparked national controversy. By the early 2000s, Joyce Meyer Ministries had grown into one of the largest Christian organizations in the United States, bringing in tens of millions of dollars annually through book sales, television broadcasts, conferences, and donations. As the ministry expanded, so did public curiosity. Was this simply the natural result of decades of successful work, or had one of America's most recognizable preachers embraced a lifestyle that contradicted the message of humility found in the New Testament? The turning point came in late 2003 when the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the major newspaper in Meyer's hometown, published an extensive investigative series examining the finances of Joyce Meyer Ministries. The reports painted a picture that surprised even many longtime supporters. Journalists detailed ministry-owned assets that included multiple private aircraft used for ministry travel, luxurious residences connected to senior leadership, expensive office furnishings, and generous executive compensation. One widely discussed detail was an office outfitted with high-end decor and costly furniture, becoming a symbol for critics who argued that the ministry's success had crossed into extravagance. The stories quickly spread beyond Missouri, drawing national media attention and placing Joyce Meyer under a new spotlight. Perhaps nothing captured public attention more than the ministry's aircraft. Supporters argued that private jets were practical tools for an international ministry operating on demanding schedules across multiple continents. Commercial travel, they said, simply could not accommodate the logistical challenges of moving speakers, staff, and equipment between conferences and television commitments. Critics saw the same planes very differently. To them, private aviation represented a disconnect between biblical teachings on humility and the luxurious image associated with some modern televangelists. The investigation also focused on homes connected to ministry leadership and executive salaries. Critics questioned whether donor contributions intended to spread the gospel should indirectly support such an affluent lifestyle. Defenders responded that many of the reported assets belonged to the ministry itself rather than Joyce Meyer personally, and that successful nonprofit organizations often require experienced executives whose compensation reflects the scale of their responsibilities. Joyce Meyer Ministries, by that point, employed hundreds of people, operated international humanitarian programs, produced daily television broadcasts, and organized major conferences around the world. Supporters argued that comparing such an organization to a small local church failed to recognize the complexity of running a global ministry. As headlines spread across newspapers and television news programs, public opinion became sharply divided. Some Christians felt disappointed, believing ministers should intentionally avoid displays of wealth regardless of how the money was earned. Others viewed the criticism as selective, asking why successful business leaders, entertainers, and authors were rarely expected to apologize for financial success while religious leaders faced constant scrutiny. The controversy extended well beyond Joyce Meyer herself. It reopened a broader national conversation about whether pastors and televangelists should live differently from the people they serve and whether financial prosperity undermines spiritual credibility. The growing debate eventually reached Washington, D.C. In 2007, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, then the ranking Republican member of the Senate Finance Committee, launched a high-profile inquiry into the finances of several prominent televangelists. Ministries led by figures including Kenneth Copeland, Benny Hinn, Creflo Dollar, and Joyce Meyer came under congressional scrutiny. The inquiry sought information about executive compensation, ministry-owned assets, and whether tax-exempt organizations were complying with federal nonprofit rules. Although the investigation attracted enormous media attention, it was important to distinguish an inquiry from an accusation. The Senate was requesting transparency, not alleging criminal conduct. Joyce Meyer Ministries chose a different approach from some of the other ministries involved. Rather than resisting the inquiry, the organization cooperated with investigators and provided extensive financial information. When the Senate inquiry concluded, it did not find Joyce Meyer Ministries guilty of fraud or criminal wrongdoing. Instead, the process prompted additional discussions about governance, accountability, and nonprofit best practices. The ministry later strengthened its financial oversight and continued its long-standing membership in the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, an independent body that establishes standards for financial transparency and responsible governance among Christian organizations. Supporters cited these developments as evidence that the ministry welcomed accountability rather than avoiding it. Joyce Meyer herself never attempted to distance herself from the controversy. Instead, she confronted it directly. One of her most frequently quoted responses was simple: "I don't apologize for being blessed." She argued that wealth, by itself, is not sinful, and pointed to biblical figures such as Abraham, David, and Solomon as examples of people whom God blessed materially. Meyer maintained that Christians should judge how money is earned and used, rather than assuming that prosperity itself indicates spiritual failure. She also rejected the idea that ministers should be expected to live in poverty simply because they preach, arguing that decades of writing best-selling books, speaking internationally, and leading a large organization naturally produced financial success. Her explanation persuaded many supporters, but left critics unconvinced. Some argued that regardless of legality, Christian leaders should voluntarily adopt simpler lifestyles to avoid even the appearance of excess. Others believed the criticism reflected a double standard rooted in discomfort with successful religious figures rather than objective evidence of misconduct. Even today, opinions remain deeply divided. But this was not all. Far from it. Just when the financial controversies began fading from the headlines, Joyce Meyer found herself connected to another tragic story that shocked the nation. In May of 2009, Christopher Coleman, the longtime head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, murdered his wife, Sherry, and their 2 young sons in Columbia, Illinois. Early speculation even raised questions about whether his work protecting one of America's most recognizable Christian leaders had made his family a target. But as investigators uncovered forensic evidence and phone records, the case took a devastating turn. Coleman was convicted in 2011 and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without parole. Joyce Meyer was never accused of any involvement, though she testified during the trial because of Coleman's role within the ministry. A later civil lawsuit against Joyce Meyer Ministries was ultimately dismissed, leaving the organization legally cleared, but forever linked to the case. Years later, Joyce Meyer again made headlines when she suspended her television program on the Daystar television network, following allegations involving the network's leadership. The accusations were not directed at Meyer or her ministry, but the decision reflected the growing pressure on major Christian organizations to respond swiftly whenever controversy emerged. Looking back, these episodes reveal how Joyce Meyer's ministry repeatedly found itself surrounded by headlines, even when no wrongdoing was attributed to her personally. Yet none of those stories truly explain the woman behind the ministry. The greatest revelation of Joyce Meyer's life was yet to come, and when it did, it changed everything. When Joyce Meyer revealed it all. After decades of headlines about luxury homes, Senate inquiries, theological debates, and public criticism, it would be easy to assume that Joyce Meyer's greatest secret had something to do with money or ministry. Instead, when Joyce finally chose to speak openly about the darkest chapter of her past, the revelation stunned even many of her longtime followers. It all began inside the walls of her childhood home. Remember how she reflected that hers was not a Christian household? Well, as it turns out, the actual truth was much darker. In numerous books, interviews, and sermons, she has described being repeatedly abused by her father throughout her childhood. The abuse, she says, continued for years, creating an environment of constant fear and emotional isolation. Perhaps even more painful was her belief that her mother knew something was terribly wrong, but failed to intervene. The effects of that abuse did not disappear when she reached adulthood. Instead, Joyce has said the abuse shaped nearly every part of her early life, leaving her with anger, fear, insecurity, and low self-worth. She believes those wounds influenced many of her choices, including her first marriage. That relationship brought emotional abuse, infidelity, and financial betrayal before she finally left. Years later, after confronting her childhood trauma, Joyce realized why she had accepted such treatment. This became a central message of her ministry. Wounded people often make wounded choices. As Joyce's ministry expanded, she made a decision that many public figures in her position might have avoided. Rather than keeping her past hidden, she chose to speak about it. Surprisingly, she eventually forgave her father before his death, and even continued visiting him later in life. She never pretended that the abuse never happened or excused what he did. Instead, she did not want to allow the past to control her future. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.